Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, revealing the untold history of American Muslims.
The story of Muslims in the U.S. is not one that we discover, it's one that we encounter.
From before the nation's founding to the 20th century, how did American Muslims shape the United States we now know? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Long before the United States was even founded nearly 250 years ago, tens of thousands of Muslims were already here. Some left behind incredible stories that give us a glimpse into their lives.
I was born in Persia and raised in Afghanistan. I came to this country in 1861 with an American officer, a consul, but I don't remember his name. I couldn't speak one word of English at that time.
Enslaved Muslims, freed Muslims, even immigrants who fought in the Civil War.
About 2 or 2.5 months after my arrival, I enlisted at New Haven, Connecticut, having been persuaded to enlist while under the influence of liquor.
Their stories defy misinformation and stereotypes and are found in old diaries, traces of archival records, and documents hundreds of years old. Those stories are at the heart of the PBS series American Muslims, A History Revealed.
Graham, who is the director of the project and started it, white British man who was married to a Bangladeshi Muslim woman, wanted to hear our story. He heard such fascinating tidbits of our history and also worked on PBS projects like Henry Louis Gates' series on African Americans and then Saw series on Latino Americans, all these different groups, and said, why is there no Muslim American series? My name is Maytha Alhassen. I'm an executive producer on PBS's American Muslims, A History Revealed.
Well, Maytha, welcome to The Take. It is really a pleasure to have you here, especially because you and I go way back, working together in a past life right here at Al Jazeera. And ever since, I have followed your work in Hollywood and academia, righting the wrongs of the portrayal of Muslims in pop culture and in media. So when you reached out to me about being a part of this documentary, there was no way that I was going to say no. Share with us your 30-second elevator pitch. How do you describe this series to producers and execs here in Los Angeles?
I just first want to say thank you for having me on and for being a part of this, because you've been following me. I've been learning from you.
I appreciate that.
The basics of it is when a child opens up in the U.S. in a public school, the story of American Muslims, a textbook, what is there? We are in those landmark historical moments, but our stories are not folded in. Our perspective is not included. And it's not about forcing us into the story of American history. It's about revealing people that have always been there and people who have transformed this nation, not as contributors, making it so that we have earned our place, but as integral agents and movers of the story of America.
And that's what did it for me. Perfect. So I love learning about history, but aside from the broad strokes of two of the stories that we tell in the series, I had never learned most of what we feature in any history class of mine. What was the moment that you realized the extent of this history being untold and that you needed to be part of it yourself?
Well, I'm curious which two you did know.
I knew the story of the enslaved African, Yaru Mahmoud.
Oh, great.
And I knew the story of Jefferson having a Quran.
Yeah. I, along with the other executive producers, Hagir Ali, have been doing various iterations around what the story of American Muslims is, or being a part of it, being a part of the telling of it. So when this came around, he was one of the executive producers already. And in another previous life, we were researchers for the Malcolm X Project at Columbia. So we had to learn the history of Islam in America because that context was crucial in being able to talk and tell about the massive presence of Black Muslims in the story of Muslims in the US. So I knew some of them, but just like you, stories like Muhammad Khan were new to me, and Florence as well, Florence Watts, which you hosted that episode. So if they were new to me as a scholar, they must be very new and really intriguing for not just non-Muslims, but Muslims as well.
And Muhammad Khan, who we heard his voice or reenactment of his voice at the top of this episode, and Florence is one of the first known Black Muslim Americans to be photographed years ago. And so we tell those two stories in the documentary series. So let's dive into one of the stories that the series brings to light from the early 1900s, the story of one of the first mosques in the U.S., built by immigrants who arrived from then Greater Syria and settled in North Dakota, a place I think it's safe to say people rarely think about when they think of thriving Arab or Muslim populations. Tell me about your connection to that story and what you made of that story.
Ayman Ishmael, who's the host of that episode, goes to the Arab American National Museum in Michigan, and he sees the door there. I've passed that door as well and didn't know the full extent of the story. So we ended up telling the story of Mary Juma, who came from what is now Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and the successive descendants who were a part of building this, restoring this mosque, and then unearthing the story of the mosque. I mean, the story talks about the racialization of Arabs, how Muslims were received as well, Arab Muslims, but also the tricky friction, tension around the fact that Muslims, Arab Muslims in particular, and other groups were used as a buffer between the U.S.'s settler colonial project to displace folks. That had happened about a decade before homesteading became a policy that was available to Americans who at the time were considered free white people who could earn property. So, I mean, there were multiple processes happening that the fact that these Arab Americans had to prove their whiteness to have access to this program and then be a part of something that likely was a project that, you know, Arab Americans would suffer from in terms of European colonial settlerism in the region.
Wow. It really speaks to the fact that history is messy.
Yes.
And you all, as the historians telling the story, don't shy away from that mess, because the land that the people with the heart of this story that we're telling had just been taken away from Native Americans about 10 years prior to them arriving on it and settling on it and making it thrive again for a whole new generation, a whole new community. Talk to me about the idea that people might think that what's in the news currently right now, headlines about Syria, are very far away from them and have nothing to do with them, and may not realize that actually the people that helped settle the land that you're living on were from that part of the world.
I'm going to tell you a little bit of a funny story, which is I'm a college professor. I was a TA also when I was doing my PhD. And I cannot tell you how many people there's the story of Nicole Mattson, who's the one telling the story of her family, the Jumas. I can't tell you how many people look like Nicole Mattson or even are what we would say are Black Americans who have shared with me that they have Syrian grandparents.
Wow.
We don't have census records, so we don't really know. I mean, there were various moments in the census where actually Syrian was on there or Turkish was on there, but we don't truly know how deeply embedded this community from Greater Syria is in our own ancestry, besides the fact of being key players in history. You know, when people first learn about the history of Syrian Americans, it's, again, kind of funny because it is around these prerequisite naturalization cases, because they were the first what people would call ethnics to be able to successfully be considered white. The other interesting game that I love to play, because so many people have also changed their last names, is to do that historical excavation, because inevitably you will find some kind of Syrian who's been transformed. And again, this is kind of like the merger of what I've studied in Hollywood with my work as a historian.
After the break, the story of a formerly enslaved bricklayer who went on to own property right outside of Washington, D.C. So, Maytha, all of these stories are so big and so impactful, but at the heart, they are intimate slices of ordinary people's lives who go on to make extraordinary impact, whether or not they realize it at the time. And more often than not, they are not realizing at the time. That is like the recently unearthed story of Muhammad Khan. You mentioned him earlier, an immigrant from Afghanistan who traveled to the U.S. in 1861. He fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he left behind this 200-page pension file documenting his experiences and his fight to get his pension. And I got the chance to leaf through these ancient, to me, pages of this file, which was really a thrilling experience. What do you make of his story and why it's important today?
How we even found it is part of the story. So the fact that this 200-page document shows us the history of his migration into the U.S., how he had entered a white unit, because that was part of not being able to get his pension, was trying to prove that he was in this white unit that was entitled to a pension. And then again, the story of a changing racialization in somebody's lifetime. He gets captured and sent to a contraband camp because he was thought to be a runaway slave from the South. And again, at this time, he's fighting in the Union Army. And as you know, and you went to those sites, some of the bloodiest battles that he miraculously survived. And then we get to a point where he's trying to argue for what's his. And he's, at this time, it's this tragic end to a remarkable story. But one part I really love about this episode is our highlighting of the unexpected racial solidarity that happens at the end of it, which is he's not successful in getting his pension, but the Black Americans who were former soldiers in the Union Army are now working at the pension office, feel for him, and loan him money. And how many times do we hear this story in the Muslim American community of that coming together, that camaraderie across racial lines? It just proves that there was something a little bit more malleable during this time period. And also, another thing that we talk about in this episode is that the Civil War was a global event. It's an international event. It's not just contained to the U.S. because a quarter of the Union Army is foreign-born.
Wow.
And I just want to add,
people knew that.
I don't know if it's going to be a big spoiler alert, but I love the story of how he was recruited and your reaction to it.
Yeah, apparently, we'll spoil this for people because it's such a good tidbit that one of the tactics that recruiters made to get people to join the army was giving them libations, giving them alcohol, giving them opium, giving them drugs. And it's believed that that happened in this case. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So you work in this industry, what outsiders would call Hollywood. And we know that it has a huge influence on American pop culture and even politics. And for years, Muslims and Arabs have been boxed into these roles as extremists, terrorists, enemies of the state, or one-dimensional hijab-wearing characters that throw off their hijab at the first chance they get. Is a series like this the antidote? Does this complicate the narrative in a way that will change it?
Something that is so insular to the Hollywood space community industry that I don't know if people on the outside are aware of is this concept of IP, intellectual property. So where a majority of our stories are coming from are rights-based stories that somebody has either written as a book or even profiles in newspaper stories, press. And so one thing that these production companies that have been in communication around are picking up are stories almost dominantly around a terror framework. Now, if we flood, this has been part of my own strategy, if we flood the IP space with our stories, and I'm a believer in more stories, the better, and especially ones that, from this Huck and Hollywood report that I produced for Pop Culture Collaborative in conversation with Zahir, stories that we call ones that have intimate knowledge about communities. This is what we hope and we pray, and especially with their popularity, will catch the eye and attention of people that work in these production companies, these creative execs, to say, wait a minute, there's an Afghan man fighting in the Civil War. Maybe we just need to add one to the Civil War story. Or we're talking about Chicago in the Great Migration. Why don't we have a Black Muslim woman as part of the story as well? So if it's not the main story, which I think all these stories can stand alone and be really inspiring or inspires the imagination of a writer, then at least let them be the characters that they were or lived, that because there are examples of us in every era, in every geography.
And so that is something that this series is hoping to change, however incrementally. We know the series has just crossed 1 million views across the 4 films. It is amazing. And that's just on YouTube alone. So clearly there is an appetite for this. The YouTube comments have been filled with really lovely comments from people saying that they really enjoyed learning about these stories. What do you make of the public reaction so far?
I'm laughing because when do we say YouTube comments are
almost never
praiseworthy, are enlightening as well? There are folks who are sharing their relationships to some of the stories. So I remember I was a little reticent for us to do the first mosque, possibly the first masjid mosque in America, because it was a story about people from Greater Syria, as you mentioned. And we know that there's an issue within our community of overrepresentation of Arab supremacy, Arab dominance. And I didn't want people to get the impression that this whole series titled American Muslims was going to exclude certain communities or be only speaking to the Arab American experience. So folks were waiting, anticipating more, and then it seemed like very pleasantly surprised. We had a comment, I remember, of somebody who shared Fulani ancestry, and that's clearly the story of Mamadou Yaro, Yaro Mamourt. We have folks that are talking about crying, watching a prayer scene, getting chills. And
that was me. I did. So the story of Mamadou Yaro, one of the American Muslims featured in the documentary, he was painted in 1819 by this famous Revolutionary War portrait artist.
Charles Wilson
Peale, who also painted presidents. So this is very unusual to have a painting of a formerly enslaved African in America who then goes on to own property in Georgetown, a very ritzy part of the greater D.C. area, Washington, D.C. area. And yes, his story and watching his story gave me chills.
Yeah. So many people also mentioned that they cried, that they burst out in an emotional experience when they watched the Muslim community, the current Muslim community in the DC, DMV area, pray to honor him and to give him the janazah prayer that he probably was denied when he passed away. So the story goes, he's likely buried in his backyard. So we see this Muslim community praying in his backyard with that spirit. Peale actually remarked about in his diary, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, man is no good unless religion comes from the heart. And that had a deep effect on him.
Truly incredible. Well, finally, Maytha, what are the lessons from the films that you take away and that you want others to take away? What do you hope it accomplishes?
We have some basic frames that we've developed in seeing the patterns and being intentional about our filmmaking approach. So one of them is that we're not just trying to fit Muslims in this inclusion center of a dominant story. We're trying to expand the frame of the American story to show what happens when you expand a frame, to show the people that have always been there. And so the story of Muslims in the US is not one that we discover, it's one that we encounter, because they're waiting for us almost as, in our faith tradition, God is a treasure waiting to be found. They're part of these jewels in our history that we need to go to the archives and do digging to find, going through pension records, going through painters' diaries. And the other is that Muslims were talked about frequently in the abstract. And so we really intentionally strove to put at the center these characters that could reflect the story of the times as we tracked their historical journey. And then something else which was crucial is the fact that we've always been here can be used as an ammo or arsenal against charges that we're not American, that we don't belong. But that shouldn't be what we need to feel worthy in this place, because somebody that arrived 3 days ago doesn't mean that they aren't entitled or part of the story of the US. So we want to demonstrate how capacious the story is, how multifarious it is, how messy and complicated it is, but also invite curiosity so that we have folks who are continuing to do the work of this unveiling, unearthing, and revealing of these jewels in the history of the US.
And that's The Take. You can find a link to the PBS documentary series in the description below. And we're always listening to what you think of the show. Let us know what kind of episodes you'd like to hear more of and what you thought of this one. We do read the comments, so go ahead and put your thoughts below, and we'll check them out. We'll be back.